out your phone, turn it off, stow it back away someplace where it can't be in your reach. Thank you. Today, roundtable, 4 p.m., Cooperage. Okay? Another announcement, Danielle. Giants game, those of you who have tickets, 9:30 a.m. Where, Danielle?
Outside of the police station.
Outside the police station. Lunch will be provided. Yes, there were some questions about that. Okay? Anything else on that? Okay. So today we begin, I think we sort of concluded a series at the end of the last one, sort of with Dr. Boutin talking about educational approaches to your identity, to your college identity, and who you are, who you want to be as a college student, and kind of stuff that's all about the FYU program. Today we inaugurate a series of lectures that are all addressing the question of human identity from a much more, I don't know how to put it, kind of from a variety of rigorous academic perspectives. And we begin with an absolutely central question relating to academic discussions of human identity, and that is the whole question of nature versus nurture. Whether or not human identity is mostly in our genes or whether it's in our nurturance, our upbringing, our social, all the stuff that surrounds us socially. I think Dr. Boutin will probably work to deconstruct that binary for you today. Dr. Boutin is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology. He's coordinator, correct me if any of this is not up to date.
No, you're good so far.
Coordinator of the Cultural Resources Management MA program. She calls herself a bioarchaeologist. I would love to know more about that. Focusing her research on the ancient Near East, all the Eastern Mediterranean cultures there. And she's done a lot of archaeological work there. I would love to take your classes. And she's studied at major institutions all over the world. Her PhD is from the University of Pennsylvania, her bachelor's from Pomona College. Would you please offer a warm FYU welcome to Dr. Alexis Boutin.
Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay, good. First of all, aside from the identity thing, I want to know if I can go to the Giants game on Saturday, just because I'm participating here, because that sounds awesome. All right, so hi everybody. I'm Alexis Boutin. I am in the anthropology department. My research is in bioarchaeology, which is, as you probably can tell, kind of a hybrid term, the biological aspects of archaeology. Specifically, I focus on human skeletal remains that are excavated from archaeological sites and understanding what they can tell us about human life ways and death ways in the past. I'm actually not going to talk about that much today at the roundtable this afternoon. I would love to talk about that further with you. This lecture I've tried to keep a little bit more general and kind of relevant to your daily lives. So I'm guessing most of you don't go out and work on skeletal remains from archaeological sites every day. Although you should, it's really interesting. And so what I do here at Sonoma State as a bioarchaeologist, I teach classes in biological anthropology, which look at the evolution of human biology and behavior, including the introductory class, which hopefully some of you guys will take, because it fulfills a GE, awesome class, Introduction to Biological Anthropology. And I also teach archaeology classes, so looking at the material culture aspect of human civilizations. So I'm taking kind of one aspect of what we do in Introduction to Biological Anthropology and expanding on it today, again in a way that hopefully you can relate to your own daily lives. I understand that have you started reading Middlesex or you're going to read Middlesex? Going to read. You've started it, going to? Some of you maybe should have started it and going to. Either way, it's a great book. I actually, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it today, but we will talk a little bit about sex, gender, and environment. Okay, so the title of my talk is Genes, the Roles of Nature and Nurture in Creating Personal Identity. So is your identity based more on the genes you were born with or the genes that you wear on your body today? So I have to teach you a couple of technical terms first, and I promise these are the only technical ones you're going to learn today, but they're kind of the basis of what I'm going to be doing in the lecture. And they are genotype and phenotype. Okay, so your genotype is the particular set of genes, the particular set of genetic material that you carry and that every living organism carries. So the genotype is like the genetic constitution of each individual. The phenotype is consists of the observable, outwardly observable traits of an organism that are under genetic control. So at a greater or lesser extent, some of them are completely under genetic control, some of them are only somewhat under genetic control. That's what we're going to be exploring today. But either way, it's the physical manifestation of the genes. We often think of phenotype in terms of anatomical traits. So what color is your hair? How tall are you? What color are your eyes? What's your skin color? But phenotype also can manifest as biochemistry and as behavior. So if we look at, just as one example, we could look at anybody in this room, but to look at a well-known person, Amy Winehouse, right? An anatomical aspect of her phenotype is that she had, I don't know what color her hair actually was, but let's say she had dark colored hair. I think she's wearing a wig in that picture. A biochemical aspect of her phenotype is that maybe she was prone to addiction, okay? She was prone to becoming addicted to certain substances. And then a behavioral aspect of her phenotype could have been her musical talent, but she had a great musical talent. And all of those three aspects of phenotype were related to her genetic makeup in some way, either a direct product of her genes, or maybe nurture played into them as well, as we're going to see. So there are lots of different relationships between genotypes and phenotypes, as I've sort of been suggesting. In some cases, the phenotype is the direct result of the genotype. That is, one single gene results in one phenotypic trait. In really a lot more cases, multiple genes factor into the expression of one phenotypic trait. Okay, we're going to see examples of these. And most phenotypes really are quite complex, where the phenotypes are the result of a very complex interaction between an individual's genotype and the environment. And a lot of times it's hard to tell what the contribution is of the genes versus the environment. Okay, and that's what scientists are really interested in finding out, is which is more causative here, the genes or the environment. So in other words, kind of your genotype in some ways represents your nature, and this is showing it's called a karyotype, a picture of all of the chromosomes in one human cell. So your DNA being in those chromosomes. So your DNA, the genes you're born with, represents your nature. Your environment, representing your nurture. We'll talk about what environment means, but kind of the way that you're raised, resulting in your phenotype, you. You as a sea wolf, what you look like today, how you behave today, what your biochemistry is like today. Okay? So to look at a couple examples of these genotype-phenotype relationships, really the easiest one to understand is probably the ABO blood type system. Okay? This was one of the first category where the phenotypic trait is a direct product of one gene. Very straightforward. That is, nature is entirely to blame for your blood type. Nurture has no effect. Your environment has no effect. Okay? There's one gene, it happens to be located on chromosome 9, that codes for a particular protein found on the surface of your red blood cells. And this gene has three versions, the A version, the B version, and the O version, right? Hopefully that sounds a little bit familiar, because if you know anything about blood types, you know that those are the blood types, A, B, and O. So A and B represent two different versions of this protein, while O represents actually the absence of the protein. You inherit one gene from each of your parents, and they combine and interact with each other, depending on relationships of dominance and recessiveness, to result in one of the following blood types. Your blood type is A, it's B, it's AB, or it's O. Okay, and again, that's entirely the product of your genes. Nothing about the way you're raised, nothing you can ever do will change your blood type. In fact, if you get a transfusion of a different blood type, you will die. So that is completely written in your genes. That's all about your nature. But most of our traits in our phenotype are not like that. They're not so straightforward. They're much more complex. Most of our traits are what we call polygenic. So ABO blood type is a monogenic trait. Mono meaning one, polygenic, poly meaning multiple. So here multiple genes contribute to a single phenotypic effect. Okay? In fact, most of our traits, most of the traits that kind of help build our identity and that we use to distinguish ourselves from one another and make up social categories are polygenic. So things like hair color, eye color, skin color, your height, your onset of puberty, when that starts for you, that's also polygenic. So multiple genes factor into determining the expression of these phenotypic traits. And let's see if I can find my pointer here. Well, I can't. But anyway, you can see the distribution is like a bell curve. So basically, with stature, with height, for example, most people fall somewhere in the middle. So there's a few people at the shortest end of the bell curve, at the far left end, a few people at the right who are very, very tall. Most people fall somewhere in the middle because there's so many possible genotypes or combinations of genes that underlie the expression of a single phenotype. Okay, your height, your hair color, your eye color. There's only one way that can really be expressed in a pretty simplistic way. So these polygenic traits, which again are the most common ones in our phenotype, are determined by many genes, but they're usually not just the result of genes. The environment also factors in to a way that these polygenic traits are expressed. Okay, so really that's where we get this idea of the complex phenotypes. Okay, so that's what we're interested in as scholars, as critical thinkers, is what contribution has the genotype made to the phenotype? What contribution has the environment made to the phenotype? That is nature versus nurture. So scientists attempt to actually measure the relative influence. And they do it in terms of something called heritability, right? Which is actually measuring the proportion in terms of frequencies of the total phenotypic variation that's caused by genetics rather than the environment. Okay? And they actually give it a number. It ranges from 0 to 1. So they quantify how much relative influence genes are playing or nature versus the environment versus that is nurture. So like an environment where all organisms have exactly the same, are raised in, population, where all organisms are raised in exactly the same environment, if there was any variation evident amongst them, all that variation would have to be due to their genes. It would have to be due to their nature, right? Because they were all raised the same way. In that case, heritability would be 1. All variation is completely inherited. On the other hand, if the organisms were raised in different environments, those different environments might be the cause of that observed variation. So heritability would be much lower, it'd be closer to 0. Okay? So really, I have this picture. It's probably hard to see with the light, but the only environments in which scientists can really test these sorts of ideas are in a very, very controlled laboratory environment with like petri dishes, right? Growing cells in petri dishes to ensure that environments are the same. But anthropology is the study of humans, right? We want to study human variation and try and explain human variation. We can't do that with petri dishes in a laboratory. That would not be ethical. So anthropologists and other biological scientists have to be much more creative in how they're going to understand heritability. And so to do this, they use something called the twin method. They use the twin method to estimate the heritability of a given phenotypic trait by comparing what we call the concordance rates of identical and fraternal twins. You can see identical are called MZ, monozygotic. They came from the same zygote, the same fertilized egg. Fraternal twins are called DZ, dizygotic. They came from 2 fertilized eggs. Okay? So the implication being that the genotype of identical twins is identical. They have the exact same genes. Whereas the genotype of fraternal twins, coming from 2 different eggs, is no more similar than that of any siblings would be. Okay? So non-identical genotype. Okay? And then again, the concordance rates are measuring how often do twins exhibit the same phenotypic trait. Okay? So while identical twins basically have the same nature, they often have similar nurture as well because they were raised, they were brought, they matured in the same womb, they were raised in the same environment. Whereas fraternal twins were matured in the same womb, raised in the same environment, but they have different genes. So if we compare the outcome of identical twins versus fraternal twins, that is one way to measure the influence of nature versus nurture. So for example, the ABO blood type of monozygotic or identical twins is 100%. They have the same genes. ABO blood type is directly related to to the genotype. So of course, they all have the same blood type. All identical twins have the same blood type. But only about 2/3 of fraternal twins have the same blood type. Okay? Which makes sense, given how many genes siblings typically share. Okay? So that suggests to us that the variability in blood type is completely under genetic control, totally due to nature. That's frankly not what scientists are interested in, because that's kind of a duh sort of question. What's more of interest are things like stuttering, for example. Stuttering is something that 77% of identical twins share, but only 19% of fraternal twins share. So clearly genetic factors do play some role in whether or not a person stutters. There's some aspect of where that's written into the nature of the genes. Okay, but it seems like environment must also play a role, because otherwise, if it didn't, then 100% of identical twins should both stutter. Okay, there must be some environmental influence on how that gene is expressed to result in stuttering or not. Another kind of good contemporary example is the California Autism Twin Study. This came out, the findings were published just within the last few years. And they found with autism that the concordance rate for identical twins was 70%, and for fraternal twins it was 35%. So it does seem like genetics has a fairly big influence on whether autism is going to manifest. Okay, but then the scholars went a step further. They actually compared those numbers to the concordance rates for different age siblings. That is, so looking at twins and then maybe their older sibling, or twins and then their younger sibling. And that told us that if one child in the family has autism, then there's only a 3 to 14% chance that an older or younger sibling will also have it. That's much lower than the 35% we saw with the fraternal twins. Okay, so what's going on? What do fraternal twins have in common that's different from what any other non-twin siblings have in common? Are we allowed to ask questions of the audience in these lectures? I feel very weird not being interactive. Okay, does anybody know? What do fraternal twins have in common that other siblings don't? What do they share? Yes?
The womb at the same time?
Exactly. They have the same the same womb environment, okay? So their DNA is no more similar to each other than any other siblings, but they were brought to maturity in the same womb. They were birthed as part of the same process, okay? So this is a great example of environment, okay? The fetal environment in their mother's womb. So when I showed you that picture before of, the environment is sort of like the recycling sign with the clouds and the air and everything. That is one aspect of environment. But really, your environment is more about your social environment, really. The parents who raised you, the family that you're raised as a part of, where your family lives, what your family eats, the kind of health care your family receives and what they give to you. Okay? So how is the fetal environment shaped for the baby who's inside its mother's womb? That's kind of an unfair question. Let me try again. What are pregnant mothers supposed to do and not do? Smoke, yes or no? Not supposed to smoke or supposed to smoke? Not supposed to smoke. Okay. So, right, that's part of the fetal environment. Does the mother smoke or not? What else can affect the baby's development? Right, alcohol. Okay, consumption of alcohol, which, by the way, is culturally relative. Anthropologists like to note fetal alcohol syndrome is not present in all cultures. Some cultures it's actually thought to be helpful to drink alcohol. But that is part of the baby's environment. How it's going to develop is how much alcohol is consumed, and whether that's helpful or harmful during pregnancy. Okay. Anything else about the fetal environment? Right, yeah, absolutely. Maternal nutrition. Is the mother getting enough calcium? Is the mother getting enough iron? Is she getting enough of the various vitamins? Enough folic acid? Folic acid consumption by the mother has a big influence on making sure that the spinal cord is formed properly in the infant, in the fetus. Okay? So you think about your environment. Where do you start being nurtured? And how does it start affecting your genes? Your nurturing started before you even were aware that you were a you, right? It started when you were a tiny little zygote, a tiny little fertilized egg in your mother's womb. okay? So this nurturing is not just about like, do you yell at your kids or not, do you spank them? It's about how you took care of yours, how your mother took care of herself, the choices she made when she was pregnant. Because in fact, you do so much growing and developing as a fetus. You do more as a fetus than you do any other time in your life. So it really is critical, the kind of, the course of the pregnancy, your mother's pregnancy. And then this continues, the way that babies are born. I mean, they're finding these days that vaginal delivery versus a cesarean section can be beneficial for babies because the babies passing through the vagina can pick up a certain bacteria that helps populate their digestive system with helpful biomes that help them have a kind of a healthy digestive system versus a cesarean section. So that's another aspect of nurture, of environment, of a choice that's made about how that baby is born. Okay, and then it just goes on and on and on. You know, the air you're breathing, is it polluted? The water you're drinking, does it have lead in it? The house you live in, is there lead in the paint? The food you're being eaten. Sometimes I worry about this with my kids because they're not eating enough fruit and vegetables. You know, are they going to grow up and have weak bones or something like that? So all that is aspects of your environment. Okay, and it turns out that with autism, to go back to the slide. It seems like environment, again, autism has a genetic component for sure, but it's not all genetically determined. And so some of the environmental factors thought to play and that are unique to twins are, maybe it has to do with the age of the parents when the babies were conceived. Generally, the older the parents, the more likely the children are to have autism. What was the mother's nutrition like? Was she sick at all when she was pregnant? Because it seems like the flu virus seems to lead to outcomes of autism in children in some cases, which is one reason they really suggest getting flu vaccinations for pregnant women. Were the babies born prematurely? Were they underweight? All these are aspects of environment that factor into the development of autism. Okay, so clearly, nature and nurture work together with different amounts of influence to result in our phenotypes. Okay, so there you go. Parental age, maternal diet and health, and birth conditions. Okay. But a really important question then is, are genes our destiny? Genetic testing is really popular now in our society. You know, you can buy these DNA paternity tests at the drugstore. You can get your DNA sampled at the doctor's office. With these dogs, you know, I go to my vet's office and there are these pamphlets saying, find out what breed your mutt actually is. You know, it's so exciting and cool. But, you know, then on the back it says, like in the disclosure section, this actually doesn't really tell you very much. It could be used to help predict what diseases your dog might get or its behavioral tendencies, but it's more just kind of for fun. But, you know, genetic testing can be for fun. And some people to learn about where their ancestors came from, you know, oh, look, I'm 3% Neanderthal, or, you know, my ancestors came from Eastern Europe, that sort of thing. But there are a lot of other implications to genetic testing, right? Just literally yesterday on Facebook, somebody posted one of these scenarios where it said, I got genetic testing and it caused my parents to divorce. Because this person was looking for their ancestry and found out that somebody else was out there with 50% of the same shared DNA that they'd never heard of before. Well, who do you think that was? Who else tends to have about half the same DNA as you? Your parents or your siblings. So this person had a brother that he never knew he had, a half-brother in this case. And that the mother never knew that the kid had either, because her husband had fathered this other child. Okay, so it caused the parents to actually divorce. And so now the guy who took the test, who actually is like a molecular biologist, is saying you should put a warning on these that they're really just fancy paternity tests in a way. So, you know, there are a lot of implications for how these are used. Some people have learned that they were adopted. People have learned that, you know, maybe in some cases they had ancestry from Africa, whereas their ancestors had always sort of passed as white for various social reasons. Okay, so this genetic testing can open up a lot of, it can be a Pandora's box in some ways if you're familiar with that metaphor. Okay. Another really common reason that people undergo genetic testing is to learn about diseases. Okay, what their risk is for developing certain diseases. And interestingly, there's a company called 23andMe that is based out of Silicon Valley is actually developed by the wife of one of the Google founders. And just recently, if you go to their website, you'll notice that they've had to change their mandate. They used to offer these kind of the testing for certain disease-causing genes. They now can no longer do that because the FDA cracked down on it. The Food and Drug Administration says that that's something that should be only under the purview of doctors, done in a doctor's office. You can no longer just kind of anywhere, anybody can buy it over the internet. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about now, is learning about your health from your genes and how your health is related to your genes. Okay, so there are a lot of reasons why somebody might undergo genetic testing in relation to their health, right? One could be to see if they're a carrier of a certain gene. Especially if a person's from a particular part of the world, particular population, they might want to see if they carry a gene that could show up in their child. Because if their partner carries the same gene, that child could develop a harmful disease, like Tay-Sachs disease is something that's common in Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish populations. Cystic fibrosis is common in Northern European populations. When I had my kids, I was tested for cystic fibrosis, that gene. Because if it turned out that I had one copy of that gene, they would have wanted to test my husband to see if he had it too, because that would have meant that our children were at risk of developing cystic fibrosis if they received two copies. So that's one situation. Prenatal testing, again, testing the fetus itself to see what's in its genes, whether it has the correct number of chromosomes, for example. Having one too many chromosomes or one too few chromosomes as a result of errors during meiosis or the formation of sperm and eggs can result in major developmental and physical alterations. Okay. Newborn screening. So for example, when babies are born, they get a little stick, a blood stick in their heel. They take a little drop of blood. One of the things they test for is phenylketonuria, which is a condition in which people consume phenylalanines in their diet. It can cause mental retardation. And phenylalanines are found in a lot of foods. They're found in meat, fish, eggs, dairy, legumes. They're also found in this artificial sweetener called aspartame, like Diet Coke. So as long as the child with phenylketonuria doesn't consume phenylalanine, they will never develop this condition, this mental retardation. Okay, so if they know that ahead of time based on what's in their genes, they will be okay, right? That's part of their nurture, the way their environment they're raised in. That's why they can't drink Diet Coke. If you ever notice when you're drinking Diet Coke, it says, people with PKU, it's called, don't drink this because it has phenylalanine in it. But again, that's where if you know ahead of time what's in your genes, you can make conscious decisions, your parents can make conscious decisions that will really affect the outcome of your phenotype. And then again, disease identification and treatment. In some cases, if a person's already sick, getting genetic testing can help them identify that disease that they're suffering from more precisely, like which version of it they're suffering from. Maybe there's a treatment for that version. Maybe it can help the patient's doctor choose the medicines that are going to work best with that person's particular genetic makeup. Okay. Again, there are a lot of ethical considerations when it comes to why to get genetic testing done. On the one hand, a lot of the advances that we sort of take for granted now in biomedical research could not happen without genetic testing, because we can't learn about the genes unless we know what different genetic makeups look like. Okay, when people volunteer to contribute their genome, scientists get more data to learn about how diseases actually contribute to health and to disease. In Iceland, the little tiny European country up in the Arctic Sea, they, with permission, read the genomes of almost all 800,000 inhabitants who happen to be closely related to one another because it's an island. And they found out that, in particular, there are certain diseases that were inherited, that were transmitted through family lines. They identified the genes for those diseases, like arthritis, for example. They found there's a gene for arthritis because it showed up in all these related people who suffered from arthritis. So it can be really, really useful and, in fact, essential for certain advances in biomedical research. But then you got to think about safeguards for privacy, right? In some ways, this has a little bit been negated by Obamacare, because part of the question becomes, well, let's say that I am found to have the gene for osteoarthritis. I haven't developed it yet, but I could in the future, and it could mean that I need a lot of physical therapy. It could mean that I need surgery, and that's all going to cost a lot. Okay, so am I going to get dropped from my health insurance? Part of Obamacare was saying that if you have a pre-existing condition, you can still get health insurance, because some people, if they've had cancer in the past, until Obamacare, they couldn't find somebody to give them health insurance currently because of the potential of having to pay out so much for that person's care. Okay, but some of these privacy concerns have resulted in certain legislation, like HIPAA, which is basically the privacy rule of the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act. Because your genes are part of your health information. It promises that if you get your genes tested at your doctor's office, your doctor's not going to turn around and say to the insurance company, oh, don't insure them, they've got the arthritis gene. Or, that your employer can't get a hold of that information and decide they don't want to hire you because you're going to cost too much to employ, okay? In 2008, this GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, became federal law, which does prohibit discrimination based on genetic information as far as it relates to health insurance and employment. But it doesn't cover life insurance, it doesn't cover disability insurance, it doesn't cover long-term care insurance. So we're starting, there's kind of a lag here between what science is able to find out and what the law is able to do in terms of protecting people. It's starting to catch up, but there's still quite a ways to go. Okay. All right, so to kind of, this has captured the popular culture imagination. So some of the pictures I have up here are from the X-Men. You guys have probably seen the X-Men comics or the X-Men movies. And what's kind of the lesson behind the X-Men? Can anybody tell me? Let's say not particular movie by movie, not that like Wolverine is super hot or anything like that, but like what's the idea about the X-Men? What makes them different from other people? Can somebody raise their hand and tell me? You're all telling your like seatmates, but tell me. They're mutants. Okay, what's mutant about them? They have powers. Okay, so the implication is that something is different about their nature, right? There's mutations in their genes that make them different from other people. And in general, do people like the mutants or are they scared of them? They're scared of them, right? So this is the idea that if we know a certain amount about people's genetic makeup, it could cause people to get scared of them, try and make laws against them. In some cases, we see them, being rounded up and put in concentration camps, things like that, okay? So there is a potential for, really life-changing measures to come into place based on genetic information, okay? I'm going to try and show you a little film clip, and I'm not sure if this is going to work or not. We're going to try. It's from a movie called Gattaca, which some of you have seen, hopefully. If you haven't, you should. It's in the library. Check out the DVD. I'm just going to show you one clip here. Okay, so I don't know if we're going to get sound. Where'd the sound girl go? Is the sound person around? The tech person? Maybe not. Let's try that. There we go. Okay, listen.
Condition, 60% probability, manic depression.
Okay, this is not seeming to be going on well. All right, sorry, that did not seem to work very well. Okay, the point of it is, I suggest you watch Gattaca. You can kind of hear the nurse was saying at the birth of this child, neurological condition, 40% probability, and then she goes on, it gets scarier and scarier. Heart condition, 90% probability, likelihood of schizophrenia, 99% probability, right? So basically, in the future, the idea is that when babies are born, their fate is kind of read from their genes, with these probabilities of getting certain diseases, okay? And that's really scary, right? Like, I would be terrified if any of my kids have been born and they were told there was an 80% chance of them, getting heart disease. And so then the icing on the cake of this scary scenario is they said, predicted life expectancy is 30.2 years. Okay, and then the parents are really upset because they say 30.2 years, that's not very long, oh my God. And then you have to think about the fact that it's a movie, right? How do they know that the kid's gonna live for 30.2 years? He could get hit by a bus when he's 10. He could drown when he's 15. By the same token, he could live till he's 80, right? Nobody really knows, okay? When we hear these, predictions of likelihood of getting a disease, just because you could get a disease doesn't mean that you will get that disease. There's a big difference between you may get something and you will get it. Okay, so that's where a lot of the interplay between the nature and nurture, the genes and the environment comes in. Okay, and a really important consideration if you're trying to figure out whether or not to get one of these genetic tests for a disease like this is, are there any ways to prevent or treat the disease for which I'm being tested? Because if there's no cure for this disease, do you want to know about it? Would you want to start treatment sooner? Would you want to change your lifestyle in order to reduce the chances of you getting that disease? Would you want your kids to be tested? Would you want them to know? Right? There are a lot of ethical considerations in mind. So here's an example of one of these mutations that can very, very easily be tested for in the genome. There are mutations at the genes called BRCA1 and BRCA2. And these are totally normal genes. Okay, BRCA1 and 2 are normal genes. You can see where on the chromosomes are located. BRCA1 is on chromosome 17, BRCA2 is on chromosome 13. Most people, those are normal genes. Their function is that they're tumor suppressors. Okay, they ensure that cells stay stable and don't grow uncontrollably. But some people have mutations at those genes. Those genes don't work quite right, and as a result, their bodies can't suppress tumors the way that they should. Okay, so for people with mutations at those genes, BRCA1 and 2, their risks of developing certain types of cancerous tumors are much higher than the people without those mutations. Okay, so for example, women ordinarily have a 12% chance of developing breast cancer over their lifetime if they don't have the mutation. With the mutation, they now have a 60% chance of developing breast cancer over their lifetime. For ovarian cancer, without the mutation for women, 1.4% chance of developing it. With the mutation, between a 15 and 40% chance. So your likelihood goes way, way up with this mutation. And for men with those mutations have increased risks of breast, pancreatic, and prostate cancers. So it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, it goes both ways. Okay. So let's say you do test positive for a mutation at BRCA1 or 2. What do you do with that information? Okay. Again, according to your genotype, your nature, you're more likely than the average person to develop one of these cancers. But you don't know for sure if the cancer actually will develop. Your nurture, your environment has a big role to play in it. Okay? So what are your options? Well, one of your options is surveillance. You get checked regularly to see whether or not you have that cancer. So if you're a woman, you might get mammograms very regularly. Another option is called chemoprevention, which is you take certain drugs to reduce the risk of developing that cancer. So for breast cancer, you could take tamoxifen, which is used to treat breast cancer, but also to prevent it from developing. You could avoid certain risks, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But certain lifestyles that encourage cancer, like you don't eat a lot of fatty foods, you exercise frequently, you don't smoke, that sort of thing. What's been really common and prominent in the media lately, and I don't have a picture of one of these people, is prophylactic surgery, which is removing as much of the tissue that's at risk of developing cancer as possible. So having your breast removed if you're a female, having your fallopian tubes and your ovaries removed as well. So in the media, Sharon Osbourne, Christine Applegate, and Angelina Jolie is the other really prominent person who within just the last couple of years had double mastectomies for this reason. They tested positive for the BRCA1 or 2 mutation. And they decided to have this prophylactic surgery electively. They chose to. Let's see, Sharon Osbourne, Christina Applegate had, in fact, suffered from the cancer. And so she, as part of her treatment, underwent the mastectomy. But Sharon Osbourne and Angelina Jolie had not. They had not developed cancer, and they still decided to go ahead and have their breasts removed. Okay? In Angelina's case, I believe it's because her mother had died from a type of cancer, ovarian cancer, that resulted from the same genetic mutation. Okay? So these are big decisions that have to be made. You have to decide what to do with this information, and it can be as radical as permanently altering your body in response. Again, based on a likelihood. Not that you're definitely going to get it, but that you might get it. Okay? So some of the factors that go into a person's risk of developing breast and ovarian cancer for any person, breast or male or female, breastfeeding is one thing that can, so I skipped ahead. So some of the factors that increase the risk are your age. Generally, people who are older than 50 are always at higher risk for developing breast cancer, no matter what your genes are like. Your family history, if you have a mother, daughter, aunt who developed breast cancer, you're more likely to get it as well. Hormones, the longer you're exposed to estrogen, the higher the risk of breast cancer. So women who had their first menstrual period early, before age 12, who had their first child kind of late, after age 30, or went through menopause after age 55, have been exposed to estrogen for a longer part of their life cycle than average. So they have a slightly increased risk. Postmenopausal women who had hormone replacement therapy, also exposed to more estrogen, increased risk of breast cancer. Obesity, heavy alcohol consumption, 4 drinks or more per day. All of these are not aspects of the genotype, right? All these are environment. All these are choices that people make to a large extent. Even though, menstruation and menopause are not necessarily environmentally determined, when that starts is conditioned by what you eat as a child, maybe how much exercise you get, what your overall body weight is. Okay, so there's a lot of environment that goes into the risk of breast cancer. Okay, some of the factors that reduce risk of breast cancer are things like breastfeeding. Some of the hormones involved in breastfeeding, it can reduce the risk of breast cancer. Taking birth control pills can reduce the risk of ovarian cancer because they reduce your ovulation. Basically, the less busy your ovaries are, the less likely they'll develop tumors. Regular exercise can reduce the risk. That is strenuous exercise, 4 hours a week or more. Okay, so how you live your life has a huge influence on whether or not you're going to develop cancer, no matter what is written into your genes. Okay. So this example is more kind of applicable to females for the most part. But another cancer that males or females are equally likely to get is pancreatic cancer, for example. Again, risk factors: being older than 55, smoking cigarettes because of the chemicals that enter the blood, obesity and a lack of physical activity, having type 2 diabetes, having a high-fat diet, okay? But also, your genes factor in, okay? It seems like there are some certain inherited genetic mutations that might cause up to 10% of pancreatic cancers, okay? Notice I say pancreatic cancers, plural, because cancer is a very generic word for a huge range of conditions. Okay, so there are different types of cancer that can come from different causes. Causes related more to one's behavior or more to one's genes. In fact, there are at least 20 genes where mutations could raise the risk of pancreatic cancer. Okay? So this is a very, real life application of where nature and nurture factor in for you. This is kind of depressing though. So let's talk about something a little bit more fun, which is keeping your youthful appearance. One example for males would be male pattern baldness. Okay, something that I had always heard is that if you're a male, you can predict if you're going to go bald. You look at your mother's father, your maternal grandfather, and if they were bald, then you're going to be too. Okay, so let's see. Mother's father. So my son's in pretty good shape because my dad has quite a bit of his hair. That's great. And it turns out this is primarily an X-linked condition, meaning it rides along on the X chromosome. So that basically males always inherit the X chromosome from their mother. So it's the mother's genes that are going to influence this, okay? So you in fact can look at your maternal grandfather to see if you're male, to see if you're going to get bald or not, okay? But it seems like with male pattern baldness, there are also other genes involved that are not related to the parent's sex necessarily. So the father's genes could play a role as well. So it's an interaction of the genes you get from your mother and the genes you get from your father. Very recently, it was found that elevated levels of a particular protein called prostaglandin D2 is found on the scalps of bald men. More is found on the scalps of bald men than on the scalps of men with lots of hair. This protein apparently blocks hair growth by making the stem cells that give rise to hair follicles go dormant. Okay, so the hope is that now they've identified the particular protein, they can then find the gene that codes for that protein and maybe develop drugs that can help treat male pattern baldness, at least when it's due to the unusual behavior of this particular protein. Okay, so male pattern baldness is largely related to your genes in this case. There's another fairly recent article called "Why Some Women Look Young for Their Age," that also looks at certain aspects of the female appearance that are under genetic control. Things like when your hair goes gray is largely due to genetic influence. Receding of the hairline, also due to genetic influence. Lips getting thinner, due to genetic influence for the most part. Whereas related factors are a bit more due to environmental influence. So hair getting thinner can be due to stress, as well as genetic factors. Skin wrinkling is largely due to, is really due to a lot of environmental factors. Like how does the environment influence how wrinkly your skin gets? What should you not do if you want to have unwrinkled skin? You should wear sunscreen, right? So lots of UV, ultraviolet radiation exposure, sun damage is going to cause more wrinkles. Smoking causes more wrinkles, okay? So your environment is really, the way you look as you age is really heavily a result of your genetics and your environment. And just one last example we can see of this with President Obama. And actually I was noticing this morning, you can't really see it here, but his hair was completely black at the beginning of the presidency. It's getting grayer, grayer, and grayer. And you can see this happening with George W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And people assume that his hair is getting gray because of stress. I often like to blame my second child. It was her fault I started going gray because it was stressful. But in fact, this is largely under genetic control. Even if he'd lost the election and had not become president, you can see the president's getting grayer and grayer. This is typical of all men around this age, okay? So the point being that much of your phenotype, whether it's anatomical, biochemical, or behavioral, is due to a combination of nature and nurture. You have a lot of control over your nature and what you pass down to your children, so be careful with it. Thank you.